Well, good morning, and thank you, Roger, for that terrific introduction, and George for setting up what I think is really the key set of questions that I hope we can all explore together. What I'll plan to do this morning is to talk with you rather briefly and then hopefully have some time for discussion, because many of the things that I want to share with you are very much works in progress that all of us are thinking about. And at a time like this, particularly after the events in Tucson last Saturday, I think the whole nation is beginning to ask, what do we know, what don't we know, and what should we be doing going forward for people with serious mental illness, especially those with serious mental illness who don't recognize necessarily that they have a problem and haven't sought treatment, which is the real challenge here. But let's get to that at the end. Let me start the story where George has left off with Maimonides, who, as George just mentioned, was not only a rabbi, but also a philosopher, a physician, and a very prolific writer. Someone who wrote about depression, someone actually who struggled with depression himself after his brother's death at sea when he was a young man, and took many years to pull himself out of this. And it was after that event, actually, that he decided to become a physician, something that wasn't in his plans previously. I want to move forward about 400 years to another great figure who was also a prolific writer, philosopher, and in this case, not a rabbi, but had been a Jesuit student who became one of the fathers of modern mathematics, and that's Descartes. Because if there's one person who probably serves as the historical foundation for much of how we think about mental illness still in this century, it's Descartes, who was writing in the early 1600s. He was an interesting character because he had his mother died essentially in childbirth, or when he was very, very young, soon after he was born, and his father raised him briefly and then sent him off to Jesuit schools. And he was an outstanding student, but he decided afterwards to hit the road, and he took a number of years doing a kind of Jack Kerouac thing, but it's not in the not so much in the 1960s style, but in the 1560s style. And that meant joining several different armies and going to different parts of Europe. And he ended up deciding to study philosophy. And he did that in a way for which I think most people in philosophy would say really kind of turned philosophy into a new direction. It created the whole field of logic. It began to get people focused on a sort of scientific basis of thinking about philosophical problems. He's arguably the father of modern geometry. The term Cartesian coordinates obviously comes from him. He's was a key figure in the scientific revolution, because at the time he lived, there was still a whole dust-up around Galileo, and it was partly Descartes' struggle for logic and for reason that made such a difference. But he got us into, I think, deep trouble. And he did that because he felt that we had to, in studying the mind, which became his real passion, especially later in his life, we had to separate out that from studying the body. He had a very simple sort of construct that he developed. He said, I could imagine being without a body. I do that in my dreams. But I could never imagine being without a mind, because then I wouldn't exist. So there must be two fundamentally different processes here. And he set philosophy, anyway, on a path that for at least 400 years thereafter separated out mind and body as two qualitatively and in some ways unbridgeable constructs that I think has gotten us into deep trouble. I'd like to sort of borrow from a popular writer of the earliest 20th century who tried to undo this, somebody who actually was alive at the same time that Freud was writing, but I bet never read Freud. This is Ambrose Bierce, who said that he defined the mind at that time as a mysterious form of matter secreted by the brain. Its chief activity consists in the endeavor to ascertain its own nature, the futility of the attempt being due to the fact that it has nothing but itself to know itself with. And that is actually part of what I think all of us have been struggling with ever since, that increasingly we begin to see mind and body or mind and brain as two sides of a coin, or in some cases, a sort of physical representation in the one case of what is a sort of a less somatic or less definable representation in the other. But the real excitement of the last decade or so has been the ability to bring these two sides of the coin into register, so that we're finally able, I think, in a way that Descartes could never have dreamt, and in a way that Ambrose Bierce would never have imagined 100 years ago, we're finally able to think about how we can understand the mind by studying the brain. And that's what I wanted to take just a few minutes to sort of unpack for you. What we know about the brain today is very different than what I was taught as a student only 35 or 40 years ago. In fact, it's very different perhaps than we would have said even a decade ago. And some of this results from the world of genomics, some from the world of neuroimaging and being able to actually see how the brain functions in real time. A lot comes out of studies done in animals to actually understand much more about what's happening in brain development. And I'll give you a couple of examples of what it seems to me are the kind of game changers in the way that we think about this. First of all, we have some sense now of the complexity of this that probably wasn't so clear to Ambrose Bierce and others 100 years ago. 100 billion cells, for starters, in the cortex, that's a lot. I mean, to give you a sense of how to put that into some frame of reference, because a billion is one of those numbers that you can't capture. If every cell was a second, a billion seconds would be 31 years. So 100 billion, if you were rewinding the tape, would take you back to about 1000 BC. That's a lot of cells. But it's worse, because every one of those cells has between 1,000 and 10,000 connections to others. So this is a very complex machine, much more complicated than any computer that anyone has ever devised. Although sometimes we like to use that analogy, saying brain is hardware, mind is software. This is a computer that can rewrite its own hardware all the time. It's a computer that has an infinite number of chips in it, something like that. A little embarrassing when you see these computer games that can beat humans at chess, but nevertheless, the computers themselves haven't designed such games. It takes still a human to actually design the software. The analogy does work, though, in the sense that the brain is essentially an information processing organ, just like a computer is. That's what it is set up to do, and what it's set up to show, in the same way that the heart's a very good pump, the brain is a very good organ for processing information and producing perception, action in the form of behavior, and to some extent, what we would generally call mental life. So you could think about the mind as a product of the brain in that sense. One of the perhaps most startling things that we hadn't understood when I was a student, I was taught that the brain largely develops during gestation, and it develops very quickly, and it's finished pretty much by the time somebody is born. And it is true that that process of development through gestation is extraordinarily fast. In the first and second trimester, the brain's creating about 250,000 cells every minute, which is a lot. When a baby's born, you've got about a 1 pound organ there. It's a different organ in many, many different ways. One of the things we know is that the way this brain develops is that everything is connected to everything, and the process of development, the way in which experience changes and the way that genes really change brain development is through essentially what's a sculpting process. It's the carving away of connections, not the elaboration so much of connections. I don't know why it was done that way. That doesn't seem an efficient evolutionary process to create something that has got so much exuberance in it and so much hyperconnection. And you have the visual cortex sending axons all the way down to the to your ankles, to your feet at the beginning, all of which are retracted, all of which disappear over time. So this is a weird way to build an organ or to build a computer, but it does allow for the maximal amount by which the environment can begin to shape how this computer will run. But here's the thing that I think we misunderstood the most, and that is the way in which this is unformed for a long time. So with imaging and with other studies that have been done in the last decade, many of which were done here at NIH in the intramural program in Bethesda, we've begun to realize that even the basic geography of the brain is continuing to change in very profound ways through normal development, not to age 3, which is what I was taught, or to age 5 or 7, but all the way into the early 20s. Anybody who's had teenagers can sort of understand that they don't have a fully developed brain, but neuroscientists didn't get that until very recently, and the pictures are really compelling, that things really do continue to change right through about age 25. We should have known that. Hertz knew this a long time ago. They don't rent to people under age 25. And so the evidence had been there in so many ways, but now you can actually see this in terms of the way the frontal cortex, which is the last thing to develop in the brain in a fully adult form, which is the part of the brain that's so important for judgment and for things like having a fully developed conscience and also a fully developed sense of humor, is something that happens really much later than we thought. The second piece, besides this kind of late development and protracted period for brain development, a second piece that would add on to that is our understanding of how plastic the organ is. That's maybe not a word that you necessarily want to put on such a magical system, but this is an organ that has an ability to rewire itself in ways that we never dreamt possible. It's extraordinary. And you can see it in various ways in which experience changes so much about how the brain is wired.